We are very lucky to have Doug Miller, our local historian who is the curator at Pennsbury Manor. And I saw him at actually our Fallsington meeting. He did a really great presentation online. And I thought this is so fascinating that I'm sure friends in the community and friends in the quarter would love to know more about the history, specifically William Penn and the early Quakers and Bristol. So come on in. So join me in giving Doug a warm Quaker welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Uh, yes, anyone have any objections to being recorded? Hearing none? As we were sitting in meeting and worshiping earlier, being a historian, I had a thought, but I chose to keep it to myself. I was like, I could go Puritan on him. So I'm going to speak for about 5 hours here, okay? No, I thank everyone for coming out, and I really want to thank the meeting, both the Bristol meeting and the quarterly meeting, for inviting me. I have been doing William Penn and Pennsbury Manor stuff since the last millennia, and I work proudly. I'm a civil servant. I'm a government employee. I work for the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, which is a small but mighty history agency. We keep the records for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that go the whole way back to Friend Penn. And I had the opportunity, I was courted by the previous director to come to Pennsbury Manor in the mid 1990s, and I haven't looked back since. Now, the state being the state has loaned me out a number of times. I've been the director at Washington's Crossing twice, more recently Brandywine Battlefield, and I always claw my way back to Pennsbury because there is something very special about that site and about the story of William Penn. So I'm going to start us out going back 2 generations in Penn's lineage to his grandfather, Giles. And Giles is a mid-level merchant there in England, and he's buying stuff for his mercantile business from North Africa. And he's going back and forth occasionally. Well, Barbary pirates have kidnapped 200 English citizens, and they're holding them for ransom. We all are of the age here to remember the Somali pirates. This has been going on for hundreds of years. Well, Giles is part of a group that helped negotiate the safe release of these 200 prisoners. And because of that, it catches the attention of the king, Charles I. And Charles awards Giles a diplomatic posting to Morocco. Well, Giles wasn't a great merchant. He was a decent diplomat, but you don't get rich as a civil servant. I can attest to that. Uh, and if you don't have enough money, and you're Church of England back then, to put your kid through the best schools, one of the things you can do is buy him a position in the Royal Navy. So Giles has a son named William Penn. This will not be our William Penn, it's going to be his daddy. And he gets a captaincy in charge of one ship, distinguishes himself in battle off the coast of Ireland, and becomes a rising star in the Royal Navy. Well, Captain Penn quickly becomes Admiral Penn. In the early 1640s, he meets and is absolutely smitten by this Dutch expatriate and marries her. His firstborn son will take on his name, William Penn, or William Penn II. And the great thing, if you're a captain in the Royal Navy at that point, when you take enemy shipping, capture enemy shipping, 1/3 of the take goes to the crown. So this would have gone to Charles I. 1/3 of the take is divvied up among the crew, and 1/3 of the take goes directly to the admiral. So the admiral built up quite a war chest by capturing enemy shipping. I worked at Pennsbury with a board member many years ago who was very pleased to inform me that it was legalized piracy, that Admiral Penn was a pirate. And I always kind of poo-pooed that. Now, I know in this audience, giving war analogies is probably not the smartest thing to do, but when we captured German shipping and Japanese shipping in the Second World War, do you think we gave it back? No. For as long as there have been navies on the seas, when you capture enemy shipping, it is incorporated. Some of our ships of the line in the American Revolution are actually enemy ships that we captured and repurposed. So the admiral has this son. He wants him to have the best advantages that he can possibly provide. So he sends him to the premier elementary school in England. It's called Chigwell. While at Chigwell, the young man has two life-altering events. He actually has his first vision of God while he's at Chigwell. And it's not through a pastor, it's not through a priest, comes directly, he has this vision. He also has a near-death experience. He contracts smallpox. And smallpox at that time was probably a death sentence. Except, remember, Daddy's rich. He could have the best medical attention available at that time. And there's a miracle cure available. Mercury. Okay, everyone have your mercury this morning? Well, young William did, and it actually caused early pattern baldness in this 11-year-old boy. How cool are 11-year-old boys? You can imagine what he went through, but young William starts to wear wigs at this point. And that bout of smallpox will come back later. Young William will next be sent to Oxford, which Oxford had the reputation back then that it has today. It was a premier school. However, when you attend Oxford, which is a religious institution, you needed to dress a certain way. You needed to attend Vespers. You needed to pray at a certain time. And it appears, although I don't have primary documentation from the time period, that William's favorite word was why. About a year into this, Admiral Penn gets a letter, and I'm paraphrasing, your son is a pain in the butt, and we want you to take him away. So young William leaves Oxford somewhat with his tail between his legs. The admiral's like shaking his head. What do I do with this kid? Sends him to France to study. And he ends up at a Huguenot academy in Saumur, France. Huguenots are being oppressed in France at this point, and they are big proponents of religious toleration. So I would argue that that's where some of those seeds are planted with young William. He actually gets to tour in Europe. He is entertained by the court of Louis because by this point, the admiral has been knighted. And he goes to many different countries. It appears that he's a pretty decent linguist. He picks up on languages. He writes in different languages. And of course, in his studies, he's studied the classical languages. When he returns, there's been turmoil through England. A civil war has ripped the country apart. Charles I is the king. The opposition is Oliver Cromwell, Puritans basically who want a stronger parliament. Charles loses both the war and his head. Oliver Cromwell names himself Lord Protector of England, which I always thought that was a great title. I'd like to be the Lord Protector of Pennsbury Manor. Well, for 10 years, there is this puritanical rule in England, but Parliament continues to strengthen. After Oliver Cromwell passes, the populace of England, who were aghast that you would actually behead a king, it's okay to kind of push him to the side, but you don't cut royals' heads off. They would very much like to see a king back. Well, before losing his head, Charles had two sons. The elder carrying on his name, Charles, and the younger is James. They were hiding in plain sight. They're in Brittany. We would think of Brittany as part of France, but at that instant in history, it's actually English territory. 11 prominent citizens in England are selected to go and plead the case to Charles to come back. Leading them is Admiral Sir William Penn. On board his ships is his upstart son, who is being groomed to go into the family tradition. The two sons return to England in a glorious restoration. There's no bloodshed, there's no warfare, and for every bit of austere puritanical England, Charles is over the top opulent. So people are loving it. Well, Admiral Penn had been awarded estates in Ireland. Young William, again, is being groomed to go into the military, and there's an uprising at a place called Carrickfergus. Young William takes a volunteer lieutenant's position and goes off and actually sees battle in Ireland. After this, he's actually at a clothier because he's a fop. He's wearing the best clothing, and he's stopped by this basically tailor shop, and he's chatting up the tailor who was a Quaker. And he's like, hey, my dad and I once ran into this great guy named Thomas Lowe, and he just was so moving that my dad invited him back to his house in England or in London. And Thomas Lowe so moved him that he moved him to tears at the dinner table. And that tailor says, who's a Quaker, he says, Thomas Lowe's speaking, just a couple hours from here. Penn hops on his mount, drives out, once again meets in Thomas Lowe, and makes his decision somewhere after that he's going to set the Church of England behind, he's going to set his military career behind, and he's going to become a friend. It broke his dad's heart. His father will cane him, throw him out of the house, they'll reconcile, but their relationship was never the same. After the Admiral passes, well, actually, I should toss out, before he passes, England goes to war with the Dutch. This is a repeated theme throughout the 17th century. Admiral Penn sails off with his fleet, and the head of the Royal Navy is on his flagship. There's a sweeping sea battle off the coast of Holland, and the English fleet heartily defeat the Dutch. It's called Lowencroft. In doing so, basically England wins trade wars over here, and they will be able to take over the Dutch territorial holdings, New Amsterdam. When the Admiral is criticized after the victory for not pursuing what remained of the Dutch fleet and sinking it all, he said, oh, that was my call. But when he is praised for that victory, he said, well, actually, the head of the Royal Navy was telling me what to do. I was just following his instruction. The head of the Royal Navy is James. He's the Duke of York and the kid brother of the king. James really didn't know the front end of a ship from the back end of a ship, but the Admiral was a great politician, and he played it quite well. James takes over the Dutch holdings. New Amsterdam gets rebranded as New York because James is a Duke of York. And New York at that time goes the whole way down till it bumps into a group of basically Catholics who left to set up their own colony called Maryland. So we're actually standing on the Duke of York's land, at least short for a little while. After the Admiral passes, William, who is a firebrand Quaker, he's cranking out books, anti-Catholic tracts, and so on, and really has developed a very close relationship with the founder of the faith, George Fox. And I always, when I talk about Fox, I said he's an accidental leader. He didn't set out to found a new religion, but he found it along the way. And as late teenager, he goes on this journey, and he had been raised by Puritans and educated well by his family, and then given his reign to go out and do that exploration. So I think that, part of the heroes in Fox's life should be his parents as well. Even though they're not Quakers, even though, they had their own light, but it wasn't the inner light as he would know it. they raised him well. So Penn and Fox are friendly. They will attend each other's weddings when Fox actually settles down with Margaret Fell, who is a widow. Her husband, a judge who never was a Quaker, actually helps get Fox out of jail at one point. So there's an interesting relationship and dynamic there. But between the Penns, the Fox is attend the Penn's wedding when Penn weds Guliama, his first wife, a fellow Quaker. And Penn and Fox will go on a speaking tour in the Germanic speaking countries to profess the faith. So there's this close relationship between them. Well, Penn's back in England. It's 1670s. West Jersey is established as a Quaker enclave. And there is a dispute among some of the proprietary interests. They just can't seem to get along, or, for this audience, they can't come to consensus. Well, as you all know, you take those concerns to meeting, you don't go to court. So, Penn had studied law at Lincoln's, and they're like, hey, can you help us out? So while he's doing this, he finds that one of the proprietary interests of West Jersey is up for purchase. Well, Dad left behind a pretty substantial war chest, and he buys into West Jersey. 5, 6 years later, they still can't come to consensus. Penn has written some of the founding documents for West Jersey, or New Jersey as we now know it. And he's kind of taken a look at this group down in Maryland who established a colony as a Catholic enclave, but initially embracing religious toleration. I actually consulted with the founding point of of Maryland, St. Mary's City, and I was kind of joking with them. They were like, "Oh, we had religious toleration first." I said it only counts if you don't repeal it in 1660, which they did. However, Penn has taken inspiration from this. He's looked at it, and he's really, I think, a student of his times, and he cherry picks some of the best ideas that he possibly can. So he petitions the crown, and remember whose daddy helped put that king on the throne, and whose daddy helped the kid brother get all this land. And the idea is, I know about West Jersey. I know there's this river dividing it, and I know that the land west of there belongs to James. What do you guys think if I set up my own colony? And they're like, we like it. Charles has to get James to sign off. And there's one caveat. James is like, I like the idea of this Newcastle place. I'll probably never go there, but give me a 12-mile circumference around it. Have you ever looked at the map of Pennsylvania and seen that semicircular thing down in the southeastern corner? Goes back to James asking for that. So Penn is granted his colony of Pennsylvania. He sits down with his cousin, Captain William Markham, and he basically asks Markham, listen, I need you to be my advance man. I got to get things settled here. I have a wife. I got kids. I've got other interests of my father's, those estates in Ireland, playing court games. If you're going to be a successful colonial governor, you need to suck up to the king. So he's got to put his house in order before he can come over here. Captain Markham carries 5 letters of introduction. There's somewhere between 800 and 1,200 people, first-generation colonists, some second-generation colonists from a variety of European countries that live in what now will become Pennsylvania. The name Pennsylvania, that's an interesting part of the story. They get done with the negotiations. It's March 1681. Charles asks William Penn, what will you call your colony? And Penn proudly stands up and he says, New Wales. Charles had an advisor who hailed from Wales who absolutely hated the Penn family. So this advisor is like, don't do it. It's a bad idea. So William is asked for another suggestion. And his alternative suggestion is Sylvania or Woodlands. Charles responds, our country, England, my family, the crown, owes a debt to your father that we'll never fully be able to repay. So we're going to name it Pennsylvania in his honor. The next day, William Penn sits down and he writes a letter to one of his best friends at that time named Robert Turner. And he lays this whole story out. And there's a tagline in it. Everyone will think it's a vanity on my part. And when I tell people that story, most people don't understand that Pennsylvania is not named for the Quaker founder. It's named for the English war hero. And the debt that was owed to Penn's family originated, it's a military debt. The admiral actually was campaigning for England on foreign shores during the English Civil War. So he's not embroiled in the Civil War at home. He's fighting for England away from England. And Parliament cuts off military spending. Or as I like to put it, the legislative branch is not playing nicely with the executive branch. Sound familiar, guys? So the admiral takes the money out of his war chest to keep that campaign going, and he pays for the commissary and the wages of 2,000 troops under his command. The debt is 11,000 pounds sterling, which is a huge sum of money back then. The admiral, of course, passes before he can collect on the debt. Parliament is officially forgiven any debts related to the Civil War. So you can kind of place this one underneath that umbrella. The fact that the crown honored that debt and William Penn says a lot about that relationship. They didn't have to. However, because I'm among friends, both small f and big F here, Quakers of the 17th century weren't quite as quiet as Quakers of the 21st century, and they were somewhat disruptive to ongoing services. The charge from Fox and from that first generation that are with him is other people's souls are in jeopardy if they don't find the inner light. They would go into ongoing Church of England ceremonies, services, stand up and proselytize, frequently being so seized by the faith that they'd shake. And of course, the term Quaker was a derogatory term in the 17th century as far as the English were concerned. And one of the things that I love about the Quakers is you guys have all embraced it, and it's not a derogatory term. Most non-Quakers don't read the sign that says Society of Friends outside. They just know those of the faith as Quakers today. Charles has a great opportunity to offload 2,000 to 3,000 of these pain in the patootie people, along with settle his debt to William Penn. And Captain Markham is laying the groundwork here by introducing this new colony to those Europeans, but also there's a letter to the King of the Canadas, because Penn does not know the name Lenape yet. Captain Markham sails up to Morrisville, to the fall line, places or drops anchor there at high tide, moves inland to a place called the Greystones. There is actually a monument at the Greystones. This is where the first land purchase in Penn's name is negotiated between native peoples and Penn. I had a professor listen to my presentation. She was a chaperone on a trip, and she sent a nastygram, that's a unfavorable email, my way of, well, Penn was an exploiter. He came here. He was a colonist. He was going to, take everything from native peoples and so on. And I actually lined up a Zoom between my staff and her, and I laid out all of our evidence. The amount of money that he spent on trade goods for that purchase, which goes from the Greystones into Playwicky, which was a Native American village site. It's a small park today, following the Neshaminy, then into the river. It was 2,100 pounds sterling in trade goods. or with the interest on the debt owed to Admiral Penn, it was 1/8 of the entire purchase price of Pennsylvania. So my argument was he was not trying to take advantage. He was being encouraged by the Crown to deal fairly. In the 10 years leading up to the Pennsylvania experiment, which Penn will dub a holy experiment, uh, he actually, in that letter, says, "May God bless it and make it the seed of a nation." That letter was never meant to see the light of day. It was just between two friends, and historians have latched onto that like a lamprey on a landlocked salmon. And we have propagated it time and again. But I think it does show a little bit of his vision. He also recognized that there were people living here who had rights to the land. And in his negotiations as early purchasers, and some of the earliest purchasers were here in Bristol, you had to agree to let the Native Americans have access to the river, to their hunting grounds. They needed to be able to traverse your property. There had been terrible misunderstandings between the Lenape and other native tribes and Europeans about the European vision of land ownership. This was one of the criticisms this professor gave me, is that, oh, Native Americans didn't understand European land ownership. My response was, I'll buy that for the first generation. By the time Friend Penn gets here, you're 3 generations into it, and Native peoples are not stupid. They understood European land ownership. But Penn also understood a little bit about their lifeways. They needed access to the river for fishing. When the shad run up the river, it was a time when the Native community would gather and harvest. At certain times, you needed access to hunting lands. There are certain types of plants that grow that are used for ceremony as well as medicinal use, and they needed access to this stuff. Prior to Penn getting here, there was an Anglo-Powhatan War down in Virginia. In central Pennsylvania, there was the Fur Trade War in the 1670s, facing the Susquehannock off against the Iroquois to the north, but fed by the colonists, the Calverts of Maryland, and Dutch and English traders in New Amsterdam, rebranded as New York State or New York Colony. And the worst one, King Philip's War in New England, about a decade before Penn gets here, 1/3 of the colonial population of New England will die in that war. 50% of the native population will die in that war. Wars are expensive, and the Crown didn't want to see that. Penn didn't want to see that. So you get the right guy at the right time coming into the right land with the right native group. If it had been a native group that was hostile, the Pennsylvania story would be radically different. I was asked to kind of cue into some of the earliest settlers here, and a couple come to mind. I know we have Sotcher descendants here. John Sotcher was a overseer at Pennsbury. He falls in love with the head housekeeper. The Penns attend their wedding, but Sotcher actually starts the first ferry from Bristol going across the river. By that point, he is a man of means. His house is still extant in Levittown. You have Carpenter, as in Carpenter's Hall, buying a large tract of land here as one of the first purchasers from Penn. There's a tract of Carpenter land where I live in Horsham, Carpenter's Park, and there are numerous early Quakers who basically get a small piece of land here. A number of them come as indentures. Penn actually set up early on that as an indenture, when you complete your indenture, you could basically, you were given 50 acres of land inland. It was a great strategy to move a trained workforce inland to start to develop it. And Bristol, because of proximity to the river, becomes one of the fastest growing communities here. We're also right across from Burlington. Burlington was where the yearly meeting was happening. And I've had many people ask me, well, why did Penn build at Pennsbury? Why wasn't he down in the city? Well, first off, I mean, he was smart, but he really couldn't see the future and couldn't have guessed how quickly Philadelphia was going to grow. Burlington's where the yearly meeting is happening. It's an active meeting. There's a market town, and there's not much else on this side of the river at that time. And where the river turns, that's the best farmland around. And if you look at the map, Pennsbury's on the elbow of Pennsylvania that sticks into the side of New Jersey. So Penn comes here after Markham has negotiated his purchase. During that time, he lays out his vision for what his ideal home will be. Penn lived in many different places. There was only one that he had designed and built from the ground up, and we're just a couple miles downriver from it. Pennsbury was his ideal place. Unfortunately, circumstance would get in the way. Fairly quickly, a dispute develops with his southern neighbor. See, Captain Markham arrives and goes down to meet with the Lord Baltimore, the hereditary title of the Calverts, and they disagree on where the northern boundary is. From many accounts, Markham was not a diplomat. He was a seafaring captain. So I don't know how gentle he was, but when Penn arrives the next year, he's like, oh, I'll go down, I'll straighten it out. Penn proudly tells the Calverts that the southern boundary of Pennsylvania runs through modern day Baltimore. The Calvert claim, which predates the Penn claim by almost 50 years, goes to the 40th parallel. The Lord Baltimore is so incensed that I always tease people that if William Penn had spontaneously combusted, the Lord Baltimore wouldn't have tinkled on him. They will have bad blood for the remainder of their lives, and the families will be in dispute for 3 generations. The truth is, the 40th parallel is about where the Pennsylvania Turnpike is. And the Lord Baltimore in 1684 determines he's going to go back and he's going to plead his case directly to Charles. Penn's agents inform him of that, and that's why Penn left when he did. He did have a wife and children at home, but he was still trying to build this community here. He was actively pamphleting in different European languages, and not just for Quakers, but for the religiously disassociated. And again, this is tongue-in-cheek, guys, but I always say it's all the whack jobs of Europe. My ancestors were Swiss Mennonite, so we were at like the peak of the whack job scale back then. And it was a brilliant marketing ploy because if we were in England at that time, we had to pay a tithe to worship anything other than Church of England. So you had to pay to follow your religion, and many times you were being oppressed. Some of you might have heard the story of Penn getting into an altercation. He's in meeting in London as a new convinced friend, and English soldiers show up to break up the meeting. Penn is trained as a combatant. He is a veteran, combat veteran. He springs up, roughs one of the guys up, and throws him down the stairs. And everyone in the meeting's like, whoa, you can't be doing that. And he's like, oops. We think that's the last time Penn raised his hand to a person. But it shows a young man who is a man of action. It also shows that people weren't allowed to worship as they chose. They were in somebody's home. Quakers were not allowed to have meeting houses at that instant in their history in England. So Penn wants to set up something different here, and he's actively courting all these people to come here. But this dispute with Lord Baltimore gets in the way, so he has to go back. Not surprising, when young William shows up, Charles kind of sides with William. He's like, okay, why don't you take charge of the lower counties? The lower counties we would know as Delaware. So now Penn has a hand in New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, as well as stealing some land from Maryland. But I don't think that counts as having a hand in Maryland. Uh, while he's there are tremendous changes in England. Charles dies. James ascends the throne, kid brother. James is an out of the closet Catholic in Church of England ruled England. James's daughter has married a firebrand Puritan, William of Orange, and they begin to raise armies against the father. James advocates. He's like, you know what? I kind of liked it in Brittany. I'm going to go back to retirement because remember what happened to James's father? He was beheaded. James was attached to his head, and he wanted to keep it that way. So at that point, William is accused of treason because of his friendship with James. 2 capital offenses in England: murder and treason. So he's under a death sentence, and he will not renounce James. And I'm paraphrasing, but he says, James was my dear friend at his height, and he'll be my friend in his desolation. So he will not turn on James. He's basically reduced to house arrest, and historians find this time period of his very hard because there's not much documentation about what's going on. He will lose his firstborn and probably favorite son, Springett, the maiden name of his first wife. Springett has made it into his early 20s, and he's devastated by this loss because he was grooming Springett to take over the colony and the family business. Within a year, he loses his beloved Gulielma, so he's at a very low point, and this is the 1690s. There's all this unrest that's going on in England politically. He is on the outs. He used to be one of the inside guys with Charles and James. He's not now. The colony is taken from him. There is a colonial governor placed here who is a military guy. Well, by this point, there is a Quaker-dominated legislature, and let's just say oil and water and leave it at that. Eventually, Penn has the colony restored. During this time, he starts to take notice of this woman who is a member of the Bristol meeting, but not Bristol, Pennsylvania, Bristol, England, named Hannah. And he begins to court Hannah. And she blows him off. So he's in London and occasionally traveling to the estates in Ireland, Castle Macroom, but basically in London. He is also attending Jordan's meeting, but he's attending many different meetings. And when Fox passes, which is contemporary to this time, there's kind of this power vacuum within the Quaker faith of who's going to be the next leader. And it really isn't Penn. He's one of the leaders. But he's going through all this personal turmoil as well. He's been in jail, although many friends were jailed for their religious convictions at that time and have been since that time. Well, a third party gets involved in the courtship. Hannah's daughter from the first marriage, Letitia, starts to write, or William's daughter from the first marriage. Letitia will write to Hannah and say, hey, take a second look at Dad. He's pretty okay. And Hannah is half of William's age. She comes from a fabulously wealthy family. Her father, Thomas Callahill, was one of the first purchasers here. Never came over, but was a big investor in Pennsylvania, so the families knew each other. Ultimately, either Hannah sees the William Penn light or Penn wears her down, but there is a wedding, and by the late 1690s, there's growing unrest in Pennsylvania. It appears that the population wants a better say in their own governance. Once again, similarity to today, isn't it? Penn's lieutenant governor at that time has been giving too many concessions to the people, and in direct conflict with what the crown wanted. So Penn determines he's going to come and he's going to straighten stuff out. This is 1699. Hannah and Letitia come with him. Hannah is extremely pregnant for the sea voyage. They make landfall in the fall of 1699. They rent a house in Philadelphia from the mayor. It's called the Slate Roof House. And it is there that the first and only child born this side of the Atlantic to that union, John the American, is born. Now, how government was set up in Penn's first frame of government was the governor calls together legislature, tells them what the laws are going to be, and then they push it out to the populace. The populace wanted a better say-so, and somewhat grudgingly, Penn revisits this model. What we get is a two-party system. You can say Senate and House, or you can say House of Commons and House of Lords. It's the first time this side of the Atlantic where the common man has a right to vote, not just the landholders. It codifies religious toleration or freedom of religion and establishes rights of jury and trial by jury, something that Penn had suffered early in his career. And when our Constitution is framed, one of the documents that they look at is Penn's Charter of Privileges that picks up the nickname the Charter of Liberties. 50 years after it becomes the law of the land, the Philadelphia legislature, or Philadelphia-based legislature for this Pennsylvania colony, have a bell cast in honor of it. It's famous because it has a crack in it, and most people don't remember that the Liberty Bell was actually cast for Penn's Charter of Privileges or Charter of Liberties. And Pennsylvania will follow that the whole way up, his rule, whole way up to the American Revolution. At the end of that final visit here, it's 1701, and a creditor calls in the chit that William Penn had mortgaged Pennsylvania to a subordinate, Philip Ford. To hear Ford's side of it, he lent Penn 5,000 pounds sterling, and Penn's reneging on the deal. To hear Penn's side of it, Ford has been embezzling from me for years, and he's a cheater. History really doesn't know, but Penn will return to England to be tied up in these legal cases. Ultimately, Ford will pass before it is settled, but Penn will go to debtor's prison. And he's only released when affluent Quakers buy him out of debtor's prison. He is hemorrhaging money on this new colony. He set up a business model based on quit rents. Quit rents are a medieval term. The idea is that you owe taxes, more or less, and homage to the feudal landlord. The problem was he didn't set up a good structure for collecting on that stuff, and he tended to trust people. They're like, yeah, we'll send you a check next week, Bill. It'll be okay. So he's spending a lot more money than he's taking in. And this is a repeated theme. He was raised in privilege. He was not a good money manager. Is there anyone here associated with William Penn Savings? Anyone? Okay, be very careful because Penn was a horrendous money manager. Hopefully those that carry on his name are much better. But by 1710, he's desperate. And he turns to Queen Anne. Anne, have I got a deal for you? For the low, low price of 16,000 pounds sterling, we have a fully developed colony. And of course, Anne says, nah, I already got some royal colonies. A year later, Penn is absolutely desperate. He drops the purchase price to the original amount of money that his dad had laid out 50 years prior, 11,000 pounds sterling. Anne says, sure, why not? But something comes up in their personal lives that they can't meet on this. The documents are drawn up. Hannah has lost her beloved father, Thomas Callahill. The Callahills had had 9 children. Only one survived to adulthood. That's Hannah. And reading into that tongue-in-cheek comment about him being a poor money manager, Thomas arranged for Hannah to be the executrix. Normally, it would have been the husband. I think Thomas understood, don't trust Bill with the purse strings. So they're dealing with all of this. And on their way back, about 3 weeks later, Penn is seized by stroke. A son from the first marriage, who is, well, let's just say the apple fell very far from the tree with this one, Billy, or William Penn III, contests the sale. Anne's like, you people are nuts. I'm backing out. So Hannah is left with a big old poop sandwich that is Pennsylvania. It's hemorrhaging money. There's unrest with the population. There's unrest in the family between the children of the first marriage and the children of the second marriage. Her beloved daughter-in-law has married William Aubrey, who is in it for the money, and he's pushing for dowry payments. He will not accept land. So there's all these family intrigues that are tying things up. And William's doctors are telling Hannah, hey, you got to keep business away from him. It's not good for him. Through the next 5 years, he will have 5 different strokes, a steady decline until he passes. However, one of my personal heroes is friend Hannah. She takes all of this in stride. She cares for an infirmed husband, and she begins to unravel the mess that is Pennsylvania at this point. She entreats a fellow Quaker, James Logan, who comes as a teenager on board the ship the Canterbury when the Penns make their final visit here. There's a story, because it just kind of tickles me. There's a sail on the horizon as the Canterbury's there, and piracy is a big problem. Penn takes his family to safely below decks. This would be Hannah and Letitia. But James Logan goes and he joins one of the gun crews on the deck. It turns out that it's an English ship. No shots are fired. It's safe. They hail each other and so on, and then they keep going. And Penn dresses down Logan for getting on a gun crew. He's like, dude, you're supposed to be a Quaker. Logan will have a lifetime of service and friendship with the Penn family, but probably the closest relationship wasn't with his boss, William, but with the second wife, Hannah. They are much closer in age to one another, and they establish a lifelong bond that is separated by the Atlantic, but there's robust correspondence between the two of them. Now, I'm good friends with the professional staff at Stenton, and I tried to plant the seed of a seedy romance between the two, but there's an ocean between them, so that didn't occur. Logan will continue his work, and actually Hannah establishes that when you're buying into Pennsylvania, you need to actually buy in. And they really start to straighten it out, and she's the savior of the colony. And she's never given that. She's never granted the title of governor, although in function she was. And to me, the proud father of a daughter who is a convinced friend, I always love strong women and stories of strong women like Margaret Fell and like Hannah Penn. So she is one of the people that I really think history would be very different without. That family dispute will go on. See, Penn had a will that said, I want my 4 sons from the first marriage, but one didn't make it. Dennis, unfortunately, didn't make it. And my wife to get Pennsylvania. And I want Billy and his family to get the estates in Ireland. If Billy had a brain in his head, he would have grabbed that and run with it because Pennsylvania was a mess. 3 months before Hannah's death is when it's finally settled, and the courts rule in favor of Hannah and the 3 sons. Sadly, they will be the 3 sons who end up propagating the infamous walking purchase that will ultimately cheat the Lenape out of a big chunk of their homeland and start them on what they call the forced removals. However, that's another story for another day, and I did promise that I would wrap up in a timely fashion and open it up for questions or comments.
You were going to mention smallpox again, and I bet it was on the Welcome.
Yes, on board the Welcome, smallpox break out, and Penn is able to go and care for people. having had it, you basically build up that resistance. I mean, okay, how many have had COVID so far? We all have somewhat of a resistance to it. It's not going to be as bad next time around, even though it changes and mutates. And Penn is noted in a number of the accounts as caring for those people, and sadly having to assist with some of the burials at sea, because about 40% of those that boarded the Welcome did not reach this shore. It was a rough passage. That's the first time over. Yes. Other questions, guys, or comments? Yeah.
Yeah, it's as you tell the story, it sounds like Penn made most of these arrangements with people while still in England.
Yes.
And my recollection is that he did come over the one time in the 1690s, but had he been here before?
Yes. He arrives.
I know he died in England and is buried at Jordan's.
Yep.
If I understand.
You understand perfectly.
And my second question, while I have the mic,
Okay.
is there a place to find a list of those first settlers?
We do have at Pennsbury some of those listings. I want to qualify. History isn't what happened; it is what has survived of what happened. So many times it's incomplete. When it comes to Penn, there was all of his correspondence survived to the American Civil War back in England. The last male descendant, who we think was going somewhat nuts, sold it all to rag dealers in London. One rag dealer looks at some of this correspondence, which at that point was 200 years old, and he parts it out to private collectors, to universities, and so on. We think the other half was pulped. So, for instance, we don't know a whole lot about the relationship with Gooley, but he was a prolific writer at that time. Did the second wife sanitize the stuff about the first wife? Maybe. Or was that the half that was lost? So your question about his visits, he comes here in 1682 and remains till 1684. That's when that dispute with the Calverts is heating up and he has to rush back and settle everything. When it comes to being a first purchaser, if you just look at the time frame, he only spends about just under 4 years here, 1682 to 1684, and then 1799 to 1701. He spends a lot more time in England, and that's where he's selling off the land. There is a guy named Thomas Holmes, who's his surveyor general, and Holmes' accounts, he's pulling his hair out because Penn's, he's not here seeing it. So tracks overlap, people are unhappy, et cetera, and Holmes is dealing with all this. The first purchasers, who were the big investors, they're buying tracts of land anywhere from 1,000 to 5,000 acres at a time. And then you, of course, have these indentures and that's only early on. That's not all the time, but for about a 2-year run, are getting tracts of land as they finish their indentures. So that land ownership and laying that all out is tough. I'll circle back to the Greystones, because reputedly the first surveying point that they used was the Greystones. So in theory, if you trace it back, every one of our homes, plots of lands, and so on, if you trace those deeds back, ultimately we'll start at the Greystones. It is just north of the bridge, the Trenton Makes Bridge. So if you're inland on the Pennsylvania side, where Pennsylvania Avenue heads north from where Bridge Street is, you'll go less than a block, and on your right-hand side, there's a neighborhood. And if you go back in there, there is a plot. And Pennsbury works closely with the descendant communities of the Delaware, the federally recognized ones. And when they come, I frequently take tribal members there, and then we go to, it's like going to a battlefield, but we go up to the Wrightstown meeting, which was the launching point of the walking purchase. And I have, upon request, taken many cell pictures for these tribal members, making a rude hand gesture to the PHMC, the PHMC Trail of History marker that's there that says Indian Walk.
I'm wondering how prosperous Quakers were in England that allowed them to come and set up their families here. We hear about them being in prison and all those kind of things, but what about what you were talking about, just of people who had means and they were able to start getting going?
Yeah. I mean, many of the wealthiest ones are actually looking at Pennsylvania as an investment, and they're investing in property here and so on. But like Penn himself, he had, he's got stuff in Ireland, he's got stuff in England, he's got stuff over here in West Jersey, in Delaware. So, those of the wealthiest class might be just using Pennsylvania to make money and not physically moving their families here. It's what I would say the middling sort, the people who have trades and so on. They've got the means to buy land, and land was fairly cheap. It's the ship's passage over that is difficult. And then you have many indentures. So you've got people who have a skill set, but if you're the ship's captain and I'm a blacksmith, I might not be able to afford passage, but I'll indenture myself to you. We reach an agreement that you will give me ship's passage, and once we reach the port of Philadelphia, you don't need an extra blacksmith, so you sell me. And it might be, to a fellow Quaker, it might be to somebody else, but you sell that indenture. And one of the things that is unique in English history is Penn is the first guy to make sure indentures are in writing, because there were many people who were being cheated in their indentures, and not just Quakers, just Englishmen and women. So depending on your skill set, your indenture may be longer or shorter. One of my favorite indenture stories has to do with Pennsbury, and there is a blacksmith at Pennsbury who, of course, his last name is Smith. He feels he's done good work. He wants to get on with his life, so he wants to leave his indenture about 6 months early. Part of it is he really is not getting along with the overseer that Penn has left there. And his mom starts to write to William Penn, hey, can Junior get out of his indenture early and so on? Well, that correspondence is crossing the Atlantic and so on. The guy jumps his indenture. He runs. And he comes back with a cannon and points it at Pennsbury. And my first question is, it's the 17th century. Where do you go to pick up a cannon? But it's in the letter from the overseer and so on. Ultimately, the guy returns. He finishes his indenture, gets his 50 acres, and he goes on with his life. But, the life of indentured people, and they were middle class and so on, but they saw a better investment to take their money to buy the land, but then indenture themselves to get that passage to America or the New World.
So you mentioned the tailor in the beginning of the story. Do you know who that was?
The
Tailor?
Taylor. So I don't recall his name, but it is in Andrew Murphy's book, William Penn, A Life. So I just don't recall the tailor's name. This would have been in Ireland that he runs into Lowe again. And, again, I think that history, you have this confluence of circumstance and so on. How different history would be if William hadn't courted Hannah, or that tailor hadn't said, hey, Thomas Lowe's speaking over there. For all we know, Penn would have gone on with his life and so on and might never have made that life conversion. Although it is my belief, it's not based on primary stuff, but within a year of seeing combat, he decides to take a different path. And I think also we know that he was spiritually curious and spiritual himself. So I think that there's, those instances in history where circumstance brings things together and pretty amazing stuff happens. So thank you, guys. So the last question that I just had was a biography that I would recommend. And me being me, I'm going to recommend two. One is Penn Light. So if you want to get, the core of the stuff that I talked about, but you don't want to be in it for 500 pages, it's called Architect of a Nation. It's a 60-year-old pamphlet book. It's about 60 pages, written by a guy that I knew, John B. Trussell, Colonel Trussell, when I was a college intern with the State Museum last millennia, he was at the end of his career with the PHMC. You can still find it in Amazon and so on in libraries, but it's out of print. Most recently, the most complete and hands down the best, but it is a big read, Andrew Murphy's William Penn, A Life. And Andrew Murphy is Bucks County boy. He taught at Rutgers before UVA stole him, and I think now Michigan has stolen him from UVA.
Thank you so much.